Jerusalem's walls rose white under the sun, a city held for nearly 9 decades by Crusader rule. Behind them stood a shaken garrison, survivors of Hattin, exhausted and fearful. Yet the people of the city prepared for a siege unlike any they had known. For outside their gates was Salahuddin, victor of Hattin, commander of an army whose patience had already undone kings. But this was not to be a reckless storming. Salahuddin understood that Jerusalem was more than stone. It was a place sacred to all faiths, and the eyes of the world would remember not just that it was taken, but how it was taken. The siege began with precision. Muslim forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies but avoiding unnecessary destruction. Towers and engines were built, their wooden frames groaning as they were rolled into place. Arrows darkened the sky, stones slammed into walls, but Salahuddin's approach remained measured. His aim was not slaughter, it was surrender. Inside, panic spread. The defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, fought bravely, but knew resistance could not last. When breaches opened and the prospect of massacre loomed, negotiations began. Salahuddin listened, his commanders urging him to exact revenge for the blood spilled during the First Crusade. But he refused vengeance. Mercy was his strategy now. Terms were struck. Those who could pay ransoms would leave freely. The poor would be released in groups, their freedom bought by Salahuddin himself. Churches remained standing, worship permitted. When the gates finally opened in October 1187, it was not to rivers of blood, but to a disciplined procession. The cross was lowered from the dome of the rock, and in its place the call to prayer rose once again. For the world, it was a moment of shock. A city long thought lost was restored without the cruelty of conquest. For history, it was a lesson. The greatest victories are not only about breaking enemies, but about building legacies. Salahuddin proved that intelligence in war is not just in planning battles, but in knowing when mercy achieves more than any sword. And so Jerusalem was reclaimed, not as a trophy of vengeance, but as a testament that the sharpest battle plans in Muslim history were guided by wisdom, patience, and justice. The summer sun of Palestine burned mercilessly in July 1887. The Crusader army marched east from Acre, banners snapping proudly in the wind. But pride would not quench their thirst. Salahuddin watched from a distance, patient as ever. He had no need to rush. His battlefield was the land itself, and his first ally was the heat. The Crusaders, led by King Guy of Lusignan, carried the heavy armor of Europe, thick mail that trapped sweat and drained strength. Their destination was Tiberias, where a fortress garrison begged for relief. Salahuddin knew they would come. He let them march, cutting them off from wells and streams, pushing them deeper into barren hills. For days, the Muslims harried their flanks, not to destroy, but to exhaust. Arrows fell like rain, cavalry darted in and out, forcing the Crusaders to shield themselves constantly. Each step cost them energy. Each hour without water drained their resolve. The closer they came to Tiberias, the farther they slipped from survival. Finally, Salahuddin chose the place of decision, the horns of Hattin, 2 volcanic hills rising above dry plains. By the time the Crusaders arrived, their men were faint, their horses staggering. The Muslims had already seized the wells. Fires were lit across the dry grass, smoke choking the weary knights, turning their armor into ovens. The Crusaders tried one desperate charge, their banner still raised, but their strength was gone.
Muslim cavalry surrounded them in tight circles, arrows breaking their lines, spears striking where shields dropped. One by one, their commanders fell. King Guy himself was captured. The true cross, carried into battle as their sacred symbol, was seized. What remained of the Crusader force collapsed in the dust. Some were slain, others surrendered, and the greatest military power of the Latin kingdom was erased in a single day. Hattin was won, not by sheer clash of swords. It was won by patience, by knowledge of terrain, by turning the enemy's greatest weakness, thirst, into a weapon sharper than any blade. Salahuddin had shown the world that victory belonged not to the loudest army, but to the wisest.
The valley of Yarmouk stretched wide, its dry winds carrying dust across the plains. On one side stood the Byzantine Empire, with an army of perhaps 200,000, armored cavalry, disciplined infantry, and the weight of centuries of empire. On the other, scarcely 30,000 Muslims, weary from campaigns, but united under a commander whose name would echo through history, Khalid ibn al-Walid. The Byzantines believed their numbers alone would decide the day. But Khalid was not a man of brute strength alone. He was a master of movement, of rhythm, of breaking an enemy not just by force, but by confusion. And confusion would be his weapon at Yarmouk. The battle did not unfold in a single clash. For days, waves of Byzantine troops pressed forward, confident their sheer mass would grind the Muslims down. But every time they advanced, they found resistance exactly where they expected weakness. Khalid had arranged his men not as a static line, but as a breathing organism, flexible, reactive, alive. Units that faltered were reinforced instantly, flanks that bent straightened like a drawn bow. At night, the Byzantines rested uneasily while Khalid moved. He shifted cavalry silently from one wing to another, preparing feints in sudden charges. He kept the enemy guessing, never allowing them to see the true strength of his army. What looked like retreat was often a trap. What looked like weakness was a snare. On the crucial day, Khalid unleashed his cavalry in a thunderous sweep. Dust rose in thick clouds, blinding the Byzantines. At the same time, Muslim infantry pushed forward with sudden ferocity, cutting deep into lines that were no longer steady. Panic spread. An army that had come with confidence began to crumble under the weight of its own fear. The Byzantines tried to regroup, but their formations dissolved in the chaos. Soldiers fled toward the ravines of the Yarmouk River, where many met their end not by sword, but by the cliffs themselves. By sunset, the impossible had happened. The mighty Byzantine army was shattered, and the road to Syria lay open. What made this victory legendary wasn't just the numbers, it was the mind of Khalid. He showed that wars are not won by the size of the sword, but by the sharpness of the plan. And at Yarmouk, his plan cut sharper than steel.
The sun beat down on Medina, and with it came an army like Arabia had never seen before. 10,000 men, united tribes and clans, who had set aside their rivalries for a single purpose: to wipe Islam off the map. Against them stood a city of farmers, merchants, and families. Medina had no towering walls, no great fortresses. But what it did have was a prophet who thought differently. When word of the coalition's march reached him, the companions gathered, debating whether to fight an open desert or wait behind Medina's palm groves. Then came a suggestion that sounded almost absurd to the Arabs of the 7th century. Salman the Persian, who had seen wars in faraway lands, said, "Dig a trench." A trench in Arabia? No one had ever seen such a thing. But the prophet agreed. Within days, Muslims, leaders and laborers alike were shoulder to shoulder, striking the earth, breaking rocks, and carving a barrier around the vulnerable side of the city. Hands blistered, backs ached, but the trench grew. It wasn't strength of arms, it was unity of vision. When the coalitions arrived, they expected an easy march into Medina. Instead, their horses balked at the edge of a wide ditch. Warriors who had dreamed of swift charges now found themselves staring across an impassable gulf. The desert winds carried their curses, but the trench stood silent, unbroken. For nearly a month, the Quraysh and their allies encircled the city. They raged, they shouted, they tried to storm across. But every attempt failed. Archers rained arrows as soon as a rider dared approach. The trench turned Medina into a fortress without walls, a defense that no spear could breach. Hunger gnawed at the besiegers, fear spread among their ranks. Then came the storm, literally. A wind whipped through their camp, tearing down tents, extinguishing fires, and driving sand into their eyes. Cold rain followed, soaking their clothes, quenching their fury. What had begun as the Confederate army dissolved into chaos. Tribe after tribe abandoned the field, their alliance as fragile as the ropes snapping in the wind. The Muslims hadn't won by outnumbering their foes. They had won by thinking differently. The trench was more than a ditch. It was a symbol, a reminder that intellect and patience, guided by faith, could overcome even the fiercest storm of enemies. And when the dust settled, Medina still stood.
The desert wind carried more than dust that day. It carried the weight of destiny. Imagine standing with only 313 men, most with little more than a sword, some with nothing but sticks, facing an enemy 3 times larger, armed with shields, horses, and pride. Yet what unfolded at Badr was not chaos, but brilliance. Before we step into this story, take a moment, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's strategy, faith, and lessons that echo through centuries. The year was 624 CE. The Muslims of Medina had marched to intercept a caravan belonging to Quraysh, but what awaited them instead was a full army, over 1,000 strong, led by the most powerful chiefs of Mecca. Outnumbered and out-equipped, most would have turned back. But Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saw opportunity where others saw disaster. The battlefield was a stretch of desert dotted with wells. Water meant survival, and survival meant victory. While the Quraysh moved confidently, assuming their numbers guaranteed success, the Prophet ﷺ ordered his men to seize control of the wells. They destroyed the others, leaving the enemy parched under the sun. It wasn't just a tactical choice, it was foresight. A smaller army could not afford attrition, but a thirsty one could not fight at all. As dawn approached, the Prophet ﷺ aligned his troops in rows like a living wall. Archers were placed strategically to break cavalry charges, while the few horsemen on the Muslim side guarded the flanks. Every position was chosen with precision, and every man knew his role. Discipline replaced fear. Faith replaced doubt. The Quraysh charged with confidence, their banners high, their leaders certain of victory. But each rush met calculated resistance. Arrows rained in perfect timing. Fighters held their ground, moving as one body instead of scattering. The terrain, the wells, and the discipline all worked together. Outnumbered? Yes. Outmaneuvered? Never. When the Quraysh line began to falter, the Muslims advanced with unity. What seemed impossible hours before unfolded as a decisive triumph. 70 Quraysh were killed, another 70 captured. Leaders who mocked the Muslims now lay in the sand. The victory at Badr wasn't just a military success, it was proof that intelligence, faith, and discipline could shatter arrogance and numbers. And from that day, the world understood Muslim armies were not defined by size, but by strategy.